I think the key date that everyone's now looking at in the metals market is basically the end of March, because by all accounts, the end of March expiry for futures delivery, a lot of players are going to be standing for delivery of physical silver. There isn't the silver to go around. What happens in that environment? Watch this space. But I think what's really happening in the real world is that the physical stuff, whatever fun and games and paper derivative type, games we can play in the US market, the bottom line is that the actual physical asset is headed off to Asia or the Middle East, but specifically Asia, China and India, and it's probably never going to come back. It's heads I win, tails you lose. But when people stand for delivery, those games can't get played any longer because there's a finite amount of the physical asset, whereas there's an infinite amount of imaginary paper dollars. So you can play speculative games in the derivative markets till the cows come home, but the whole game changes when some significant player says, no, stuff you, I want those bars in my vault tonight. And if those bars are not available, then Houston, we have a problem. And I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but there's a guy that wrote something called the Thunder Road Report here in London, and he's a bullion analyst. And he said many years ago, the next leg up in gold will prove to be a religious experience for those people who find themselves short. I think a lot of people are going to encounter some religious experiences before this year is out in the metals market. It's an open secret that a lot of people in finance suspect that Bitcoin is actually a creation of the CIA. I have no special access to this information or not, but given the Epstein involvement or alleged involvement or suspected involvement, it's entirely plausible that Bitcoin could now be a co-production of the CIA and Mossad. So there's all kinds of dark activity and darkness and cloud and fog and uncertainty and God knows what else. But the origins of Bitcoin are more intriguing now than they've ever been. And the fact that as we're speaking, Bitcoin is basically collapsing suggests that, again, this is going to be a religious experience this year for a lot of people in a lot of ways. The system we're in requires everybody to be a debt slave forever. If what I hope is the case is that Epstein links to a lot of people in traditional finance, to name a few names, JP Morgan, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers. If anything actually practical and tangible comes about these connections, then a lot of people may inadvertently have blown their own businesses up simply by guilt by association.
I'm your host, Farzin Irani. Let's connect the dots. Welcome to Connecting the Dots, where signals speak, patterns reveal, and nothing is random. We aim to cut through the noise to expose what drives money, markets, and mindsets. I'm your host, Farzin Irani, and it's my pleasure to welcome a very recurring special guest today. Our guest today is Mr. Tim Price, Director at Price Value Partners. Tim has spent over 30 years in the capital markets, working as a multi-asset portfolio manager, and his fund has recently ranked number 1 in 2025. Welcome, Tim, and do you want to tell us the award your fund has recently won?
Thank you very much for having me, Farzin. So it's really just a league table ranking. So we're a multi-asset fund, the Price Value Portfolio here in the UK, and we happen to get recognition for a reasonable job in 2025. So we've got a fairly meaningful chunk of change in the fund in precious metals and commodities. That probably helped last year, and I hope will help this year. Clearly, the market's a touch volatile, I hear.
Yeah, is it volatile? Is it market manipulation? Let's start there, mate.
So, I mean, I think for anyone, so we've got let's go back a bit. Why do we invest in precious metals? So we've got a fairly broad mandate. So we can invest in cash and fixed income. We currently have zero exposure to bonds for reasons that we'll probably touch on during the course of the chat. We can invest in value equities from around the world. That includes equities in the commodities space, mining companies, essentially. So we have a load of those. We can also invest in systematic trend following funds and bullion. So it's a proper multi-asset fund, but as I say, the the lion's share of the fund's investments right now are in the precious metals and commodities theme. Why is that? Because I think it's one thing that a lot of the guys here have in common is a background in the bond market. So I was a bond salesman for 10 years before I moved into private client portfolio management. It helps if you know your financial history. So for example, in the 1970s, we had the Nixon gold shock where Nixon took the dollar off gold, and then every currency basically went free floating. You had I think it was the Yom Kippur War, and then Arab oil embargoes, which meant that the price of oil went up 3 times pretty much overnight. So what was the 70s? The 70s was a decade of stagflation, i.e. high inflation, but no attendant economic growth. It was a disaster for stocks. It was a disaster for bonds. The only asset you wanted to own in the 1970s was commodities. And I think history bluntly is repeating itself. So you look at the view from 20,000 feet as a sort of macro investor, I should say perhaps. And you've got, let's go back a bit again. We had a very benign 40-year trend of declining interest rates, notably in the US Treasury bond market, because that's the granddaddy of them all. And that benign downtrend in yields led to a benign downtrend, or was coexisted with a benign downtrend in inflation. China joined the WTO, so China then started exporting deflation or disinflation around the world. It was a benign environment, great environment for bonds, great environment for stocks, great environment for property. The problem is that benign 40-year trend ended about 3 or 4 years ago. And the coup de grace, if it wasn't the money printing that accompanied the COVID lockdown, the coup de grace was basically the West's decision to freeze Russia's foreign reserves after the invasion of Ukraine. So I may have touched on this the last time we spoke, but after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the seizure of Russian foreign reserves, which would have included lots of US Treasury bonds and lots of US dollars, a friend of mine pointed out at the time that even at the height of the Second World War, the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, so-called central bank for central banks, even at the height of the Second World War, these guys never dared to touch Nazi Germany's foreign reserves. So that's just what a big deal the decision to sanction Russia was. I think it'll go down in history as potentially the most catastrophic self-inflicted wound ever committed by a sovereign country, notably the States. Because what that decision, it wasn't just the US, because the UK participated in this and the EU participated in this, so it was a proper Western development. But what that decision effectively said was, you can no longer trust us or our assets as part of your basically investment portfolio. So any unaligned country, or for that matter, aligned country to the US, then had to rethink what it was going to do with its foreign reserves. And so, surprise, surprise, what that reignited was an interest in basically gold. So if you're a sovereign country and you've got a surplus and you want to invest that surplus in something meaningful, previous to say 2022, you would have quite happily put it into T-bonds. But as a result of the sanctions and the freezing of Russia's reserves, the effective theft of Russia's foreign assets, then a lot of countries will have decided, well, stuff the US Treasury bond market, we'll buy gold instead. The beauty of gold is, whatever you think about gold, whether it's a commodity, a barbarous relic, whatever, the bottom line is that gold is a form of money that is nobody's liability. It's a stateless asset. It can't be ultimately controlled by anybody. It's not one country's product to begin with. So there is a phrase, the only thing that's worse than being an enemy of the US is being an ally of the US, which is where the UK uncomfortably sits right at the moment. But that was an absolute game changer. So I think, and I don't want to sound like overly hyperbolic, but I literally think what we're living through now, as expressed by the prices of firstly gold and silver, notwithstanding the recent correction, the current correction they're experiencing, which I think is basically a nothing burger in the greater scheme of things. But we're living through what gold and silver and now broader elements of the commodities complex are saying is that on the swing investor in the world no longer wants to hold naked exposure to fiat currency, whether that's the dollar, sterling, euro, yen, or whatever. They want to own something more tangible that's been a more tangible store of value for thousands of years. That's things like gold and silver and hard assets generally.
Yeah, thanks for that general summary. There's obviously the gold thing plays out also because, as you just mentioned, there's no counterparty risk. Unless you're investing in ETFs or something along those lines, then again, even if it's a gold ETF, you are relying on somebody else to make sure that they hold it for you or they're going to keep their promises. Whereas gold held in your own possession.
Or with a properly trusted counterparty or safe, custodian.
Exactly. Isn't Germany recently trying to repatriate more of their gold from the Federal Reserve as well?
Everyone's trying to. So there's this big scramble for assets. We're at an unusual position here. So our business is located in basically the heart of the central London, just off Chancery Lane. And there's a building directly opposite ours, which is the London Silver Vaults. But the London Silver Vaults does not contain bullion. It doesn't contain bars of silver. It contains antiques. So I bought my wife some silver-related presents for Christmas because I'm flush at the moment on the back of last year's, triumph as a business. So, but there's a serious point here, which is that if you're trying to secure physical silver as an investor, good luck. You can't get hold of any. So the London market's basically dried up, and I suspect the US markets may not be far behind. So in a sense, there's a kind of a bit of a shell game going on now because people may or may not know the story of the Hunt brothers and the guys who tried to corner the silver market back in the 70s. So long story short, for anyone that doesn't know the history of the Hunt brothers, Bunker Hunt and the Hunt brothers, basically these were wealthy Texan oil heirs that were concerned about inflation. And so they decided they would try and protect their family wealth by cornering the silver market. So this is a lot like the film Trading Places, when you had Randolph and Mortimer Duke and all kinds of sort of a jiggery pokery going on. But the bottom line is they tried to corner the market. They were very successful up until the point when basically the COMEX decided to change the rules. So they introduced something called Rule Number 7, which basically made it, firstly, they raised margin requirements, which made leverage more expensive. And secondly, they basically, at the top of the market, when silver was trading at, it's gone up from something like $2 to like $50. They said, right, from now on, the only instructions we will accept will be sell instructions. So you can't buy anymore. So the whole thing then collapsed like a pancake, like a souffle, and the rest is history. Now, people might say, well, surely history could repeat itself, but the difference is profound in 2026 compared to 1979, 1980. Back in 1980, the US and the UK had complete control of the bullion market. That control is no longer the case. There are now new markets popping up, Dubai being one, Shanghai being an especially important one. The Anglosphere no longer controls the bullion market, so that would not be possible to pull off as a trick today. More to the point, the reason why gold and especially silver is rallying, in the case of silver, it's not just because speculative investors are trying to corner the market. It's because silver is the most conductive metal in the world. It's essential for use in industry, and in particular modern industry, solar, renewables, EVs, that kind of stuff. You can't replace it with anything as efficient. So it's a must-have component within the industrial economy today. Secondly, the difference between gold and silver is that gold tends to be hoarded, whereas silver tends to be used up in practical applications. For example, if you're going to fire a few Tomahawk missiles, you need several hundred ounces of silver, and you're not going to be able to recycle any of that once they're used. It's going to be vapor. So you've got all these different facets coming into, like these stars are coming into alignment. Let's then add a bit of geopolitics into the mix. So the US has now declared silver to be an essential mineral. So it's basically weaponized silver. The Chinese have basically embargoed silver, so they're not really allowing any of it to leave the country. And China, I think, is the biggest refiner of silver in the world. India just announced it's basically remonetizing silver as part of banking collateral. So you've got all these developments. You've got, firstly, a history of thousands of years as being an alternative money, like gold. And then you've got the industrial use. So silver is both a monetary metal and an industrial metal. And then you've basically got a supply squeeze. So we're using more of it than we are managing to get out of the ground. The physical market's been in shortage for 6 years now. So you've got underlying fundamentals that could never be more positive. You've got technicals that could never be more positive. For example, for people who are market technicians, technical analysts, the silver price at the end of last year broke out of a long-term 45-year so-called cup and handle formation. So you imagine a cup, a big bowl, and then a handle to the far right of the bowl. Silver price broke out of that range that had been established for 45 years. And as far as market technicians are concerned, that's a hugely positive indicator. The only thing that compares is the 70s itself, and the 1970s in commodities terms was the biggest technical breakout in history. So the commodities markets had formed a 100-year base going back 100 plus years. And in the 70s, it broke out of that resistance level and went off to the races. So in the 70s, the price of gold went up 22 times. The price of silver went up 22 times. These were opportunities to generate generational levels of wealth. And I'd argue that we're still in the early stages of something similar happening, both in gold and particularly in silver. So the fact that silver got smacked a week ago for us doesn't really mean anything. Clearly it incurred some technical damage, some price damage, but in the bigger picture, nothing's changed.
I totally agree. Nothing's actually changed. It's not like the silver shortage has gone away or the mines are producing more silver or we
I
don't
think
need
what
any
it
more
does
EVs.
arguably represent is the fact that the exchange, the futures exchange authorities in the States have lost control of the market. In the same way that you can't buy really gold or silver for love nor money here in London, you can't really transact in them in the States either, because that's paper. It's not the physical asset. I think the key date that everyone's now looking at in the metals market is basically the end of March, because by all accounts, the end of March expiry for futures delivery, a lot of players are going to be standing for delivery of physical silver. There isn't the silver to go around. What happens in that environment? Watch this space. But I think what's really happening in the real world is that the physical stuff, whatever fun and games and paper derivative type, games we can play in the US market, the bottom line is that the actual physical asset is headed off to Asia or the Middle East, but specifically Asia, China, and India, and it's probably never going to come back. So this is a generational development that can't be compared to the Hunt brothers fiasco of the late 70s.
Yeah, it's a cyclical top for the whole fiat credit experiment, I think, coming to an end. But you mentioned something there, right? And this is where I want the audience to understand the physical is totally different to what you see on a screen. What was your view? Because I recently posted just a small glimpse on LinkedIn about what I saw happened last Friday with silver, with HSBC systems going down, COMEX systems changing margin requirements. There was all these 3 or 4 nefarious things happening, and then suddenly JP Morgan had the highest shorts position. They decided to close some of their shorts position at that. What was your view on what happened? Were there so many coincidences that happened at that stage? Do you think that was normal?
It clearly wasn't normal. In terms of price action, it may have been the single biggest one-day sell-off in the history of the silver market.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, again, if you're a bank, you can play these games all the time. So look at what the characteristics of a commercial bank are, or an investment bank. You can effectively create money out of thin air and then use it to speculate in markets. And if you're doing it in a market that's notionally a commodities market, you can then, if your bet goes in your favor, then you simply scoop off a load of cash and sweep it off the table into your account. If it goes against you, you just conjure up some more money and settle for cash and pay it that way. So it's heads I win, tails you lose. But when people stand for delivery, those games can't get played any longer because there's a finite amount of the physical asset, whereas there's an infinite amount of imaginary paper dollars. So you can play speculative games in the derivative markets till the cows come home, but the whole game changes when some significant player says, no, stuff you, I want those bars in my vault tonight. And if those bars are not available, then Houston, we have a problem. And I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but there's a guy that wrote something called the Thunder Road Report here in London, and he's a bullion analyst. And he said many years ago, the next leg up in gold will prove to be a religious experience for those people who find themselves short. I think a lot of people are going to encounter some religious experiences before this year is out in the metals market.
Yeah, totally agree, mate. Generational wealth, as you said. But there's also something I've heard about these contracts, right? Failure to deliver might also mean that most people who have these contracts don't sometimes realize there's a wording or a clause in there that they could cash settle. That is why there's a lot of people rushing in right now to take delivery as
I
well.
mean, this is exactly why the Hunt brothers scenario is relevant, to the extent that in extremis, the exchanges will just change the rules. They'll create new rules, or they'll cite force majeure, act of God, whatever. And so the physical market is where the pedal meets the metal, and the rubber meets the road. So you either have the physical, or you're not playing the right game. So paper gold and paper silver are not the same thing. And so effectively, what you're literally seeing, basically the rise of multiple separate markets. Capital goes to where it's most respected. So if you treat capital badly, it'll leave that place and go somewhere it's better respected. Right now, that better place is the Asian markets, and it's not the UK or the US. So in a sense, we're looking at a false market in what happened in the States last week, because it's not a real reflection of what physical metal is doing. We know there's shortages. We know the world needs it badly. We know it's being politicized. It's being weaponized by the major economies. Corporations also need this stuff. Anyone involved in IT, AI, data servers, solar, renewables, the works. It's still within everything. So you can't get around that. And so in a sense, the whole nature of the game has changed. It's not about investing and buying or selling on price. It's more fundamental than that. It's more existential than that. It's actually, can you get access to the physical at all? And in a world where physical access is curtailed, people become price insensitive pretty quickly, because they absolutely need it, so they'll pay whatever it takes. But the real market for this stuff is not in the Anglosphere anymore. It's moving to the Middle East and Asia, because that's where the price discovery is still being permitted. And this is, as a free market capitalist and a libertarian, I find the current developments in the US and the UK quite unsettling, quite disturbing, because these markets are basically being rigged. They're being manipulated to maintain, let's say, banksterism. But as I think probably you and I would agree, there are more important things in this world than just ensuring that the bankers are paid well and kept well and can continue to get their snacks in the trough. There's a whole other world outside the financial system, and that's the one that really matters.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So what else matters, right? We went to the US. Do you want to, can we kindly touch on what do you think is happening with the Epstein? Because there was a mention about Bitcoin and stuff in there as well with the Epstein papers. What is your view on all of that?
Yeah, I mean, the Epstein thing is clearly going to be the gift that keeps on giving. The question is, do the Epstein files mean anything if no one ever gets arrested and prosecuted for crimes that have clearly been committed by various entities and agencies and people?
If this conversation resonates, it usually means you're already sensing that the world of money is changing faster than the advice most people are getting. These conversations are really about helping people think more clearly. Not predictions, not hype, just understanding how the system actually works. So if this episode helped connect a few dots for you, liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it helps these ideas reach others who are asking the same questions quietly. That's how we grow together, one thoughtful conversation at a time. Thank you.
So there used to be this philosophical thing, and I'm sure you've heard it. It's like, if a tree falls over in a forest, but there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? And so the analogy now would be, if thousands of people have committed grave crimes cited within the Epstein files, but the judicial system is hopelessly corrupted, did they commit any crime at all? So the jury, so to speak, is out on this stuff. But what I found particularly interesting over the last few days, and you touch on for example, Bitcoin. So what I haven't gone into this in any detail, but I'm led to believe that Epstein was apparently responsible for funding perhaps 60% of the original coders for Bitcoin, which may or may not be true. But if that is true, then that suggests that Bitcoin, and people, we just before, on the top of the show, before we started recording, we were discussing this, and it's an open secret that a lot of people in finance suspect that Bitcoin is actually a creation of the CIA. I have no special access to this information or not, but given the Epstein involvement, or alleged involvement, or suspected involvement, it's entirely plausible that Bitcoin could now be a co-production of the CIA and Mossad. So there's all kinds of dark activity and darkness and cloud and fog and uncertainty and God knows what else. But the origins of Bitcoin are more intriguing now than they've ever been. And the fact that as we're speaking, Bitcoin is basically collapsing suggests that, again, this is going to be a religious experience this year for a lot of people in a lot of ways.
Yeah, people who thought Bitcoin was going to be the savior and their exit strategy to the monetary system didn't realize that the powers above are the ones who.
It's potentially a lobster trap.
What is, and as I've openly said, I knew it was the CIA. I don't know if you watched the video of Richard Werner actually explaining why CIA, because he spent so much time in Japan. Satoshi Nakamoto, it's actually pronounced and explained as Nakamoto Satoshi, and he breaks it down to Central Intelligence. I heard some people say they think it came out of the NSA, but the whole thing was at that stage after the global financial crisis. They knew that the next plan was going to be electronic money, CBDC. And yes, it has been hijacked since then. And some people just think that Sailor, for example, thinks it's going to $1 million. He still has leveraged his balance sheet to kind of keep getting the last few Bitcoins he can. Some people, as you said, might be in for quite a religious experience. Yeah, and the whole Epstein thing, it's going to, well, hopefully it keeps getting more interesting because I think the Clintons are supposed to.
What I honestly hope happens is that, what the Epstein files will do will trigger genuine investigations by the authorities and prosecutions by the guilty players. And if there's any natural justice in this world, it'll also it'll accelerate what Trump has perhaps inadvertently done by the nomination of Kevin Warsh as a new Fed chairman, because that's given rise to a lot of people talking about this, what I think is mythical, the idea of Fed independence. Independence of what? The Fed's already independent of government because it's a private banking cartel. So people misunderstand what central banks actually are and what they do. But the bottom line for anyone who's read G. Edward Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island is the Fed is not an arm of the US government. It's basically a private banking cabal and a for-profit cartel whose head happens to be appointed by the president or nominated by the president. So when you view the world through that prism, then the idea of central bank independence starts to look like a bit of a farce, because the central bank is simply the regulator that ensures that the banking system continues and the big banks can never, ever fail. So if they get into trouble, they get bailed out by the taxpayer. So they're either bailed out or taxpayers are bailed in. So that I hope is what people will start to think when we discuss the role of the Fed and the role of the Fed chairman, and whether that chairman can be independent of Donald Trump in this case. There's a much bigger question: is do we need central banks at all, and what are they good for? And I would argue that central banks are one of the most malign forces in this world, because they're not on the side of the little man, they're not on the side of the individual, they're on the side of perpetuating a banking cartel that controls money. And as we discussed earlier in the context of the derivatives markets in precious metals, banks have this fantastic privilege where they can conjure up money out of thin air and then lend it on at interest. And this is one of the reasons why the world is in the mess we're in, because we now have debts, as far as the eye can see, government debts in particular. The US national debt now stands at $38 trillion, growing at the rate of $1 trillion every 100 days or so. This world of debt-backed money requires constant expansion and constant inflation. It cannot survive deflation, because deflation equates to a contraction in the money supply, which is the death of fiat money and debt-based money. So the system we're in requires everybody to be a debt slave forever. If what I hope is the case is that Epstein links to a lot of people in traditional finance, to name a few names, JP Morgan, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers. If anything actually practical and tangible comes about these connections, then a lot of people may inadvertently have blown their own businesses up simply by guilt by association. Because what's clearly going on, if you read there's a very good piece by, I think it's Escape Key on Substack that I was reading overnight, and we can put a link to it in the show notes perhaps. But it's an absolutely encyclopedic coverage of Epstein revelations that surfaced in the last week or so. And it names some of the guilty parties. A lot of names have been redacted, but it names a lot of guilty parties. And if you're in the traditional financial system, everybody's being sucked into that honeypot. Everyone's being sucked into that trough, because it was such a fantastic money spinner. People have inadvertently I suspect in the best of all possible worlds, they've triggered the collapse of their own institutions. And the best example I can think of close to home is probably Peter Mandelson, who, for people who aren't familiar with British politics, was basically Dracula, like the Dark Knight. I think someone once described him as there's something of the night about the man. Probably, possibly one of the most unpopular politicians, apart from all the other unpopular politicians, which is all of the ones we've got, apart from Keir Starmer, is clearly massively unpopular, even on a historic basis. But this is a guy that effectively was, on the one hand, talking to Epstein and earning money from his connection, and at the same time was revealing basically state secrets to the guy. Now, we have a word for that in the UK, and it's called treason. So,
well, that's treason in US as well, but who's getting arrested? No one.
Sure, exactly. So where's the accountability? So what I hope, and I deeply, it's more hope than expectation, admittedly, but what I hope is that basically what the Epstein revelations will trigger is a long overdue reaction on the part of the judicial authorities internationally to start digging at some of these things. And hopefully some of these people will actually get the justice they deserve. And that could be monumental in terms of the financial system, because it seems increasingly like everybody in conventional finance is implicated now in some respect or other, even if only by association.
Yeah, not just in finance, but in politics as well, right? I don't think much is going to happen.
It touches everything. It's like a neutron bomb that will end up destroying everyone that came into contact with it.
Or a virus, right? So supposedly affects us.
Yeah, but the thing is, I believe neutron bombs exist.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Good point you made out there. The question I want to ask you, obviously, whether it's the Epstein or the Bitcoin and all that, there's so much that's been hidden from us. And now that the population is waking up, you said Keir Starmer and stuff as well, millionaires are leaving the UK. Do you on the streets, because you're in the UK, do you on the streets see that people actually care and they're waking up? Because regardless, I think Keir Starmer, I read something somewhere the other day, under Keir Starmer, more people in the UK have gone to prison than under Putin.
The social media platforms, 30 words.
Yeah. And in Australia also what's happening was you have to give them your ID just to log online. And I saw a video this morning where somebody was in Australia for 2 weeks and she did not log into her platform because she just on principle said, no, I will not log in. And it was Substack, believe it or not, right? And she did not log in with her ID. She said, no, I'm here for 2 weeks. If you're not going to let me use it without looking for my papers, so to speak, stuff it. This morning I saw a video of her. Now she's in Bali and she said, I've left Australia and Substack still hasn't opened up my account again. Can you believe the world we're living in? Because this is where the CBDC and the control and the digital ID comes in. Do you think people in the UK are seeing through this facade?
I think on the margins, some people are. So I think, without wishing to sound overly spiritual about this, I think we are living through a period of revelation.
Yeah.
So I went on a number of the anti-COVID, anti-lockdown marches in 2021, 2022. I think I went on 10 in London. And these were incredible events because you would have maybe 500,000 people or more marching through central London on a Saturday, closing Oxford Street, for example. So the practical impact couldn't be ignored. And yet never got any coverage on the BBC or any of the other mainstream media. Quite extraordinary situation. And I remember very distinctly, before one of the marches, there was a guy in Hyde Park giving an impromptu presentation. It happened to be, covering bits from the Bible. So one of the things that he mentioned was he quoted a line from, I forget which book of the Bible it was, but it was the line in question was along the lines of, "Ye great men of the world will be brought low by their sorceries." And he pointed out that the word sorceries, the ancient Greek origin root word for that is pharmakeia. So by their pharmacies, you will be brought low, which sort of implies that the whole COVID scam was foretold maybe 1,000 years ago. That's an interesting one. The other interesting one that I heard from this guy in question was, and it was something I learned that I hadn't previously been aware of. I used to think that the terms Armageddon and apocalypse were the same thing, but they're not. So Armageddon is, this climactic battle derives from the town of Megiddo in the Middle East, whereas apocalypse, which I used to think was synonymous with the end of the world, the ancient Greek root word of apocalypse is unveiling or unmasking. So I'm minded to believe that what we're actually really experiencing globally now, and the Epstein files, I think, will accelerate this process, is we're starting to see what's behind the curtain. And I know because we were talking about it again just before we came on air, but I noticed we've both had the privilege of speaking to a gentleman by the name of, or the pseudonymous gentleman by the name of Fergus O'Connor Greenwood. And so his book, which I would recommend to everybody with some reservations in terms of, it's a bit of an ordeal if it comes as a revelation to you, the sort of the message of that book. But essentially, the subtitle of 180 Degrees, this magnum opus, is Unlearn the Lies You've Been Taught to Believe. And I'm strongly of the opinion, along with Ferguson, I dare say yourself, that we've been lied to basically forever about basically everything. And we're now living through the sort of the reckoning process of that.
Hi. As you all know, I'm Farzin Irani. After more than 20 years inside banking and finance, what became clear to me is that the biggest financial mistakes aren't product mistakes, they're thinking mistakes. If this conversation resonates, it usually means you're already asking better questions than most people. So if you built wealth, follow the rules, and still feel there's a bigger picture missing, that's exactly the work I do with clients privately. I don't offer generic advice, and I don't work with everyone. But if you value clear thinking, a strategic perspective, and calm decision making, you can apply for a private conversation via the link in the show notes below. Thanks for watching. As you said, basically everything we've been told has been the exact opposite.
Which is why the book has the title it has, which is 180 Degrees. So the only way you can understand the world is to basically invert everything, to flip it around, which is why you can't trust any of the mainstream media. You can only make sense of the mainstream media by inverting their message and trying to view it through a mirror. It's the opposite of what it actually claims to be. But to answer your question, I do think people on the margin are starting to wake up. But it's clearly taking time, because the COVID nonsense was what started to wake me up, and that's now 5-6 years ago. So these things clearly take time. But where I think Fergus does an excellent job in that book is he's very good on the psychology of helping people to understand what's going on. And as he makes clear, you can't get people from A to Z a one fell swoop. The best you can hope for, if you're patient and kind, is to get them from A to B, and then from B to C, and then after a while, let them join the dots for themselves. But you can't just go to someone and say, this is how it works, because they'll just clam up, they'll get resistant, and it'll backfire on you. He calls it the backfire effect.
Yeah, there was quite a few things in the book. Obviously, we didn't, on an interview of an hour and a half, we didn't discuss it all.
I mean, it's like 850 pages long. It's a beast.
Yeah, it is. But I actually absolutely enjoyed it. In 3 sittings, I got through it because just like you, I couldn't put it down once I'd started, and I was like, I just want to get back to it.
I think if people want a sort of objective opinion on this, because clearly we're fanboys of the book and of the author, but all you need to do is go onto Amazon, where you can still buy it, and have a look at the reviews. I don't think I've ever seen a book that's had almost such unanimous praise and really high blown praise ever about anything. Everybody who's read this, as far as I can tell, has thoroughly appreciated it, even if they found the message.
Give me 1 second if you
Sure.
Anyone wants to know what the book is, this is the one we're talking about.
180 Degrees, Unlearn the Lies You've Been Taught to Believe, by Fergus O'Connor Greenwood. And like I say, I think my impression is, of the reviews I've seen online at Amazon, for example, it's almost universally acclaimed. Almost everybody that's bought it and read it has said, this is the best thing I've ever read. It can be unsettling, so you need to be prepared mentally for reading about stuff that's really potentially quite shocking and appalling if it's true. But if you approach it with an open mind, I think all people will find it just an incredible read.
I think the book also comes out at the right time. I think there is kind of after COVID, as you said, people woke up, but there's also a bit of again, not getting too spiritual, but I think there's kind of a spiritual awakening happening around the world, where people are resonating with what is happening. Because if you see about the stories of what the moon landing, well, that was a lie. 9/11, that was a lie. What else could have been a lie? And I've started again. Okay, we won't go there, but I've obviously seen a couple of videos scientifically explained of whether we live on a flat Earth or not, and we're inside a dome and all that kind of stuff. I don't know how. Again, not going deep into that. I haven't done the proper research, but again, it is a spiritual awakening that we're going
I
into.
mentioned, I think G. Edward Griffin, the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is about the history of the Federal Reserve. There's an amazing video that I think anyone would enjoy if they haven't seen it, of G. Edward Griffin interviewing a guy called Yuri Bezmenov on, it was on US TV in 1984. You can find it on YouTube. And again, we can find a link and put it in the show notes perhaps. But basically, Bezmenov was a KGB agent who defected and emigrated and escaped to the West, escaped to the US. And I think it's like an hour and a half long, but he gives chapter and verse on how the communists, how the Soviet Union and their inner workings, how they basically set about trying to demoralize the West. And it's a fantastic account. And 180 Degrees lists exactly the same things. I think I've had this reference in 180 Degrees, but it's basically, if you want to work out, if you're trying to understand what's going on in the West now, the best way of describing it and best accounting for it is to see the interview with Yuri Bezmenov and read the relevant section of 180 Degrees. It gives you chapter and verse on what the policy is. If you wanted to try and subvert the West, you'd do exactly what Western governments have been doing now for years. You try and destroy the family unit. You try and destroy faith in God. You try and disrupt the family unit. You'd basically destroy or subvert the education system. You would subvert administrations in everything and replace them with basically, well, what I would call cultural Marxism. If you're going to be more polite, you can maybe just call it collectivism. But either way, it's poison. And what is stunning is that, in the 20th century, we had the palpable failure of collectivism and Soviet collectivism writ large in Russia, in Soviet Union, I should say, and in China, communist China. And yet here we are, we're stuck with exactly the same thing even after capitalism supposedly won the argument by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. It doesn't make any sense, but it does suggest to me that the reason the world is in the state it's in, the West is in the state it's in, is because all of the practical arms of the administrative state have been infiltrated by Marxists. And if that seems like an unreasonable supposition, I just say, well, look for yourself at what's happening. You've cited Australia. The example I would cite in relation to the crackdown on free speech and individual liberty is the fact that in the UK, you can be arrested now for praying silently outside an abortion clinic.
They're monitoring your thoughts, mate. That's what they're doing, right?
So I think there is like a digital iron curtain descending around the world, but hopefully it can be, this process can be reversed. The more people wake up, the more likely that reversal will be.
Yeah, I think the pushback is coming, man. Did you see how Bill Gates supposedly said, "Oh, the green agenda, no, not happening. Like, we don't have to worry about that right now."
So one by one, all these sacred cows, supposed sacred cows, being taken out and taken to the knacker's yard. So the whole net zero green thing is starting to be revealed as the fraud that it is. So I think you'll see over time reversal, the swing back of the pendulum against anthropogenic climate change, against net zero, against energy suicide, and these things are all to be encouraged.
I read the green. Well, as we've obviously both of us knew it was a scam, but they made people feel guilty of their carbon footprint and all of that. Do you know something I came across today, just as I was traveling, that back in, I think, 2014, there were like 240 private jets flying into Davos for the World Economic Forum. And in 2025, there's about 745 private jets. And the other interesting fact is Europe supposedly has subsidized or said, oh, no, there's no tax on private jets. And I'm thinking, how are they getting away with these kind of things? Because the average person is made to feel guilty.
As I say, not as I do. But I'd give a mention in dispatches for anyone that doesn't know him. There's a guy called Nick Hudson, who's the co-founder of a thing called Pandata, Pandemic Data and Analysis. He's an actuary in South Africa, and I've had the pleasure of meeting him and interviewing him a few times. And he's come up with something called, I think he called it Hudson's Razor, which is the idea that if you're faced with something that purports to be a global problem that requires a globally coordinated solution, that also requires huge amounts of censorship, it is by definition a fraud. So on that basis, I would give you anthropogenic climate change, net zero, COVID, digital ID, basically all of the US strategic sustainable development goals, which are effectively Marxism, cultural Marxism by any other name.
So what do you think? What's your view on Trump obviously getting the US out of the WHO, and now he's talking about the United Nations also possibly? What is
Couldn't
your
be
view on
happier.
that?
It couldn't happen to a nicer bunch of people.
Well said. Okay. I want to now kind of talk about, because we said 180 degrees, whatever the media tells you, turn it 180 degrees. What's your view on the geopolitics and the wars of Greenland and Europe and stuff? What's happening now?
I think what the Greenland thing represents is, and we touched on it earlier when we're talking about the metals and the commodities market more generally. I think what we're all seeing now is a belated recognition that the world has made insufficient investment in infrastructure spending in real things over the last 20, 30 years, or perhaps longer than that. So in other words, there's been such a reliance on financial engineering and digital shit, for want of a better phrase. There's been a complete lack of recognition that we actually need physical things. We actually need things like energy and energy sources for proper wealth. And for anyone that doesn't know it, there's a great Substack. You have to pay for it, but there's a great Substack called Doonberg that talks about the energy market very, very well. And I'd recommend that to anybody. But basically, if you do not have energy security, you do not have a functioning economy. And that's the problem that the UK is now up against. It's a problem that Germany is now up against. It's a problem that the West writ large, certainly most of Europe and the EU, is facing, which is, we've believed, rightly or wrongly, in other words, that we can somehow outsource all our emissions to the likes of China and live in this sort of green utopia. It's all nonsense. The bottom line is that you need oil, nat gas, coal. I mean, probably the future is a mixture of energy sources, but the idea that windmills can power the 21st century economy is frankly bollocks.
Oh, and windmills in South France totally different to windmills in Berlin, right? And
well, also, I mean, courtesy of the treasonous Marxist Ed Miliband here in the UK, we are covering over productive farmland with solar panels. Do you know how cloudy and rainy it is here? We must be the cloudiest, rainiest small island in the world. And at the same time, the same people are also trying to blot out the sun. None of this makes any sense. It only makes any sense if you believe Yuri Bezmenov's argument, which is they're trying deliberately to demoralize us by making us all confused, because nothing that they do makes any sense. It's all complete nonsense and counterproductive.
I was just going to say, they're that stupid. They think their citizens are stupid, right? Not everyone's thinking through the problem like us, but at least 50% of the population ain't that stupid to figure it out, that this just doesn't make sense anymore.
The people who are most reliable on this are the people who've had the least amount of education, which may say something quite profound about our educational system as well. But the idea, I mentioned it earlier, you had the collapse of basically the Soviet system in Russia, in the USSR, and then in China and elsewhere, and we've still got the vestiges of it in North Korea. But that won't last, I don't think, very long either. And the bottom line is we all accept, or we should all accept, that state-down, dirigist, statist, top-down collective thinking can never and will never work. And yeah, that's exactly what the self-appointed elites of Davos are telling us. We know best. But anyone that has a tiny inkling of understanding about how the economy actually works they know that's nonsense. That you had these great thinkers like Hayek and Mises, the great Austrian school economists, who pointed out that you can't possibly model the economy because the economy is us. The economy is every person on the planet interacting with each other. It's impossible to model that and impossible to direct it. Adam Smith, hundreds of years ago, worked out that the free hand, the invisible hand of the market, mysteriously worked magically more efficiently than any government department. But no politician or bureaucrat today will acknowledge the legitimacy of that argument. So maybe we're better off with no government.
That is the best. That is the best solution. I was literally interviewed just a couple of days back on New Zealand Money Talks, and that's exactly what I said. Minimum government, just keep our borders safe, and they don't need that many taxes then.
There's a great professor in economics here called John Hearn, and his argument is basically the only thing that government should be there for is to provide an army. No, that's a debatable point, and to provide street lighting, and that's it. Everything has to be done by the private sector.
Exactly. I think the private sector knows how to use these resources better and not waste them. But as Margaret Thatcher also said, eventually run out of other people's money. So
Exactly.
let's come back to so let's come back to the money stuff. Do you think the fiscal dominance is in full running where they just kind of let the currency kind of hyperinflate while they hold rates down, with especially the new Fed governor coming in?
I mean, it's difficult to know exactly how this plays out. It's going to be chaotic, whatever happens, and it certainly is chaotic now. My argument, or our argument, has long been that there's only if you acknowledge the debt predicament facing basically all of the West and most of the developed world, and again on a 180 degrees basis, you have to think maybe the developed world has actually now become the developing world, because I'd much rather invest in emerging markets now than the developed world for any number of reasons. Anyhow, if you accept the problem is too much debt clogging the system, then there's only three ways of dealing with that. One way is that you engineer enough economic growth to keep the debt serviced. Good luck with that, the UK and Europe. The second option is you default on it. They won't call it that. They'll call it restructuring or a debt jubilee. But it would immediately bankrupt the banking and pension fund industry. So let's discount that. So what's option number three? You've already mentioned it. Option number three is a policy of state-sanctioned inflationism. So Mises, again, to quote the great Austrian school thinker, Ludwig von Mises said, inflation is not something that comes like an act of God out of a clear blue sky like the play. Inflation is a policy. So it's no surprise that they're trying to inflate this debt away, because that's the only way they know how to deal with the problem. What I think we're seeing is that, as I suspect you do too, is the tail end of this 50-year experiment with money. Monetary systems change all the time. Monetary system regime change is part of the natural order. Monetary systems typically last about 30 years. This one's already long overdue, long past its shelf life. So something is going to replace it. And I think what's different this time is that, unlike the last 50 years or so, we're moving from a unipolar world where the big daddy of the US, basically is this policeman for everything, to a more multipolar world, which is how things used to be, perhaps pre-1945, when you have maybe the Anglosphere duking it out with maybe Western Europe, duking it out with the BRICS and Russia and China and so you've got multiple power blocks all sort of duking it out. And that's actually probably healthier than having a unipolar world to begin with. So I suspect the US wants to bring in some kind of CBDC or digital crypto type currency, possibly. I think the BRICS may well favor something that's more hard commodity backed. Who knows? But I think ultimately, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I don't think people should be forced to use any one money, because I think money is too important to be left to the government, which is why I think we're seeing the return of the primacy of things like gold and silver, because they're not government money. Either way, I think that the future is going to be a lot, potentially we'll have a lot more choice in the future than we've got today. And I think that's if it's true, it's a great development.
I think, okay, I'm going to disagree on a couple of things. Ask you this, right? This is my...
You're not allowed to, Farzin.
What I'm thinking through, okay? So as you said, maybe the BRICS countries will come out with a currency that will be backing. I don't think any government wants to back any of their currency, because that puts a full stop on their unnecessary spending and all that kind of...
No, I completely agree. Sorry to cut it. I completely agree with that one. But let's take China. China has almost certainly, we suspect, got a lot more gold than they've owned up to in purchases over years. So it would not be beyond the realms of possibility that at some point China in the very near future could say, you know what, let us introduce the gold-backed yuan, the gold-backed renminbi. And if they've got as much gold as they potentially could have, that basically almost at a stroke destroys the dominance of the US dollar if the US dollar doesn't have the same gold reserves. And there's a joke by my friend, maybe you know him too, Dominic Frisby, the comedian and self-taught financial bod. And he says, one of his advisors comes up to President Trump and says, Mr. President, we've just done an audit of the gold at Fort Knox. There is no gold at Fort Knox. And Trump replies, what do you mean there's no gold? And the advisor goes, there is no gold at Fort Knox. To which Trump replies, double the guard. We may yet have that double the guard moment in US economic history quite soon. Is there any gold there? Maybe we're about to find out. But I agree that no government would rationally curtail its ability to expand its economy through banking or whatever. But the bottom line is, this is all also about like monetary system regime change and who's top dog and king of the hill. I think what we're living through is potentially we're seeing a passing of the Western dominance to maybe a Asian dominance. Logically, Asia as a huge region and as at least half the world population doesn't get the clout it probably deserves. Maybe we're seeing the pendulum shifting over to Asia and the ASEAN economies, and that's where the real growth is going to come from. I think the West is a busted flush.
Yes, yeah, I agree on a few things, and I'll tell you why. Because I've been obviously spending a lot of time in India recently as well, and everyone seems to think India is that next big thing. And if I'm being honest with you, it ain't.
Mm.
Again,
Why
that
is
obviously
that?
In my consulting career, I'll share the intricate details with somebody who wants to know what's happening in Asia and stuff as well. But what India, like recently, let me explain a few things. Like the European Union decided to do a free trade deal with India, and they're clashing heads with Trump. So Trump also has got a free trade deal with India. The Indian economy is growing, the GDP is growing, but 90% of the population doesn't even earn $100 a month. I'm being honest, right? They're living below the poverty line. Just like the US, the top 3% own most of the wealth, about 80% of the wealth. The stocks and the funds that you see keep going up because in India, they have this thing called SIP, which is savings investment plan. And everyone, just like we have a superannuation and stuff like that, everyone just puts maybe a 2% or 5% every month from their monthly salary into this thing, and the fund manager is managing it for them. You can have small divergences and move it from a gold fund to maybe a share or an ETF or something along those lines. Most of the average person for the last few years after the COVID thing has just seen their SIP go up, unless there was a recent drop about a month back. But this is what I'm saying. People think that the Indian market is all that. And I can tell you it ain't all that. It is only when the liquidity dries out that India will feel. And I see the liquidity moves in the US market some days, and I look at the Indian market at that day, and I go, this is exactly how I figured out it was liquidity. It's just liquidity when there's a story being told which is rushing out of other markets. They go, where do we go? Okay, let's go maybe to India and stuff. I completely agree on a not a multicultural, what is multipolar world, because Trump made it pretty obvious at Davos as well that he does not want this whole thing, and he wants a sphere of influence with the Northern Americas and the Southern Americas, and that's why Greenland's coming in. And to be quite honest, I don't think China even wants a global reserve currency because they know what happens and they have to go into so much debt to become the global reserve currency. I think they're quite happy with the US being the global reserve currency till it all detonates. And I actually believe the US dollar will be the last to detonate.
I agree. It'll be the least dirty shirt, so to speak. So it'll be last man standing.
Exactly. And I think there's fault lines coming in Japan and Europe. Now, last time we spoke a lot about Japan, so the floor is all yours. Where do you think, since the last 5 months or 6 months since we spoke, what has happened in Japan? Do you want to tell us?
I mean, I'm not competent to talk about the politics that's changed with the new prime minister, but I am capable of seeing bond yields going through the roof. And so I started my career in the early 90s with some Japanese banks in London. So I experienced the Japanese government bond, the JGB yield, becoming the widowmaker trade that everyone thought, well, Japan's got so much debt that surely Japanese bonds are going to be a bust. So people are cheerfully shorting JGBs and they're getting carried out on a stretcher. And the JGB yield, I reckon when I started work in 91 was around 6%. And it went to 5, and then to 4, and then to 3, and then to 2, and then to 1, and then to 0, and then below 0. So below 0 is clearly a joke, and I don't know what the Japanese debt to GDP ratio is. We're probably about 250% now. It's probably the worst in the developed world. But Japan's really intriguing because it's a very misunderstood country, I think, to the extent that the Japanese government is hopelessly bankrupt. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But Japan Inc. at a private sector level is fantastically wealthy. And the reason it's fantastically wealthy now is because, again, this is not well understood. The Japanese loss of wealth from when the market peaked in 89 The Japanese loss of wealth between equity values and property values was the equivalent of 2 American Great Depressions. So effectively, Japan suffered 2 1930s, one after the other. And of course, we can all remember the rioting that took place in Tokyo. Well, no, there wasn't any, because they didn't riot, because they're stoic. That, I think, is the key distinction. So firstly, you've got a bankrupt government, but a healthy private sector. So avoid JGBs, but Japanese equities probably aren't such a bad bet selectively. And secondly, don't assume that the West can survive what Japan survived, because we are not made of the same stern stuff. And the encapsulation of that stoic attitude is perhaps best reflected in my favorite Japanese quote, which is, some might argue it's a somewhat poor taste, but it's what Emperor Hirohito said to the nation after the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated in August 1945. And he said, the people in the country, you should be aware that the war situation has developed not necessarily to our advantage. Now, the Japanese have a way with words, but these people have been to hell and back, and they're still going. But I think they now have some very big demographic issues, as does China. So I think that's the swing factor and maybe the wild card factor for Asia, that maybe China gets old before it ever gets rich, and maybe Japan's already on the way out, as is Korea. So there's some very big changes here that they're above my pay grade to work out how to sort of price them in. But as far as ASEAN goes, the Southeast Asian economies, as there's a fund we invest in, and the manager of that fund, a guy called James Hay, makes the point that now these people are hardworking, quite poor at the moment on comparison to Western standards, but they all want to have a house and a car and high cholesterol like the rest of us, and they'll get there. They'll get there if the government doesn't fuck it up for them first.
Totally agree. They do want to have the houses, they do want to have the cars, and as I said, growing up in India, we used to see everyone on motorcycles. Only the average person used to have a car. Now everyone seems to have a car. But this is what I'm saying, the credit cycle has accelerated in India. You can literally put everything on an LMI, which is a monthly mortgage payment, right? Everything is like a rental model kind of a thing. And if you can't afford it, they take your house or you take your car. And people are even doing holidays in India on LMIs now.
Yeah, my understanding is that unlike the West, the Indian economy, I think if I'm correct, there's a lot more private families operating than there are listed businesses. So you can't compare the Indian market, the equity market, with, say, the S&P or the FTSE. It doesn't capture anywhere near the wealth of the country.
No. And it's not evenly distributed, right? So to say that India is going to be up and coming and stuff like that. And again, I've seen a lot of infrastructure projects and a lot of infrastructure going in, but the government's taking on a lot of debt because of that. So again, people should look at the bigger picture, not just read headlines that, India is going to be the next big superpower. I do have family in India and I visit, so I'm on the ground as I'm seeing what's happening, and it's not all rosy as they say it is. Yes, it'll change in 10 years with the infrastructure and all of that. And people will get more productive, hopefully, because of the infrastructure put in place. There won't be that much traffic and pollution and all of that. But honestly, it's not what they tell you in the Western media. Anyways, I brought up the whole India-Japan thing also because multipolar definitely happening. Asia will win out of this also because it has a younger population, harder working population, as you said. And most importantly, Tim, they have gold and silver in savings. They don't just sit in bank accounts or derivatives as the Western culture does. What is your view on the war scenario? Do you think we have averted it with Trump's recent moves, or do you think we still go? I think we do. Small regional ones. What is your view on small regional ones or World War III? If this conversation resonates, it usually means you're already sensing that the world of money is changing faster than the advice most people are getting. These conversations are really about helping people think more clearly. Not predictions, not hype, just understanding how the system actually works. So if this episode helped connect a few dots for you, liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it helps these ideas reach others who are asking the same questions quietly. That's how we grow together, one thoughtful conversation at a time. Thank you.
I don't have a strong view on this stuff. What I hope is that Trump has broken the mold quite profoundly to the extent that he's not necessarily changed that much, but he's just been a lot more open, honest, frank, and transparent about U.S. interests rather than hiding behind language, hiding behind lies. So he's just completely upfront, and we're not used to politicians telling the truth. So when he says, you know what, I quite like Greenland. Can I have Greenland? Everyone goes, whoa, 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 hold your horses. But he's just breaking the rules of conventional political dialogue and diplomacy. So, and certainly the West, certainly Europe, has a real difficulty trying to understand Trump. And he knows he annoys exactly the right kind of people. As to whether we get war or not, what I'm hoping, and again, it's about my pay grade, but what I'm hoping is there's more and more people come to appreciate how much we've been lied to about everything. They will come in turn to appreciate that people are not naturally disposed towards fighting each other. It's only governments and corporations that play both sides that basically provoke big wars. So I think as that realization becomes more apparent, there'll be a generalized revulsion about whipping up an innocent populace into, let's go to war with, in this case, Russia. They're clearly angling for it, but I think a growing number of people are waking up to the fact Russia is the enemy. The enemy is in our own government.
Always has been. You've just got to point out to an external enemy, right? But do you think NATO might create a false flag? Because I'm hearing
I
something
wouldn't put
behind the
anything
scenes.
past them. But again, my hope and that reasonable expectation is that as more people wake up, they just won't be able to get away with this stuff. Everything's in the melting pot. Everything's in the mix now. Everything's up for grabs. Increasingly, as every day goes by, fewer and fewer people are trusting the mainstream media. More and more people are migrating to alternative sources of news, information, citizen journalism, which I'd like to say you're playing your own part in that process. And as the media universe fragments, I think more people are going to wake up to what's really going on and will be able to avert what was only possible in a mass media propaganda age. So I'm hopeful that as we get a lot more choice in everything, and as everything fragments, we get ultimately more peaceable rather than less.
Yeah, true. Let's hope for that. I still think because the signs I'm seeing recently through Trump, obviously, he's trying to get a peace deal on Russia, Ukraine, and he knows what he has to achieve there because he knows that could quickly turn nuclear. But again, he's focusing his attention on what Israel wants to do in the Middle East and all that kind of stuff. So I think he's focused more on that. And he's just gone, we don't want to go to war with Russia. But I've heard that he knows, and again, I won't reveal sources and all of that, but that in the US government, they're actually discussing that we won't be at war with Russia. We might be at war with China in the next 2 or 3 years. And that is why he's trying to diffuse the whole Russian angle. But it could play out so many
I mean, I don't think
different ways.
Europe could play a part because we've got no military to speak of. We've hollowed out our own military anyway. So we'll be going to war with broomstick handles.
Yeah, Europe's a joke, to be quite honest. They don't even have as many soldiers, but they... so are we both in the same camp that big money is running the world?
Well, it has been, but I'm hoping that people power is on its way back.
Well, let's hope so. Is there something you want to talk about that I kind of haven't covered? Because
No, we've covered a lot of ground. In the words of Charlie Lilly, Charlie Munger, nothing to add.
Nothing to add. Okay, so your endgame thesis is governments are going to collapse, invest in...
I think we're living through monetary system regime change. I don't know what the future will hold, but I hope can't be worse than basically unbacked fiat, which is just a disaster everywhere it occurs. So what I like to think is we're going to have a lot more seeming chaos, but a lot more fragmentation, a lot more choice. And I think hard assets will hold their own in that environment. Let's put it that way.
Okay, fair enough. Do you think any possibility of them trying a second pandemic? Because I heard some
they could try it, but I mean, it's a bit like I think about this the same way I think about monetary policy. That the Fed at some point is going to have to cut rates. But what concerns me at a sort of existential level is it's like, everyone's expecting that to happen as a result of the market crash, and then they cut rates, and then they reflate, and there's more QE to the power of 10, and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, suppose the Fed tried to throw a party, but nobody elected to come, because all this stuff is so much more widely known now. We know what the policy responses are. We know they don't work. We know they won't work. So it'll just accelerate the end game, whatever the end game is. So I think the bottom line is to recognize as an investor, to recognize that the world has profoundly changed over the last few years. The whole 60-40 equity bond dynamic doesn't work anymore. Indexation is very problematic for valuation reasons. The whole primacy of the bond market is open to question. In that world, you do not want to own paper assets because they will ultimately be worthless. You want to have a radical restructuring of your asset allocation that favors real assets over paper ones.
Totally agree. And would you recommend mining stocks at all?
Absolutely. So again, Executive Order 6102 in 1933 under Roosevelt made private ownership of gold illegal in the US. So they may well try that again, even though we're even further away from the gold standard now than we were then. On that basis, the one thing that makes absolute sense in this world, this brave new world of sort of chaos, is you can't be too diversified. So if you like gold, buy some silver. If you like gold and silver, buy some gold and silver mining companies as well. And if this thesis of commodities plays out the way we think it will, which is a long-term secular bull, then the better chosen mining companies will do exponentially better than just the physical metal itself. So I repeat my thesis that once the current noise has dissipated from the metals markets and the market stabilize, we'll be off to a new bull cycle, a new bull run. And the opportunity represented in particular by silver and by silver miners, I think will be an opportunity to create once-in-a-generation wealth.
Yeah, totally agree. The reason I asked that was, do you see any jurisdiction risk with countries nationalizing mines at all, especially we saw Venezuela and Greenland and
Yes. So to answer the question, the solution is diversify. If you only wanted previously to own, say, mines in the US, try US and Canada and Latin America and Europe and Australia. I don't think Europe's got much by way of mining to begin with. But if you are happy in one country, try two. And if you're happy in two, try four. You can't be too diversified in this world.
okay. And a quick question we haven't covered is obviously the Nasdaq's dropping at the moment, and the blockchains and the cryptos are dropping. What's your view on AI? Too overpriced, too richly priced?
In my experience, AI feels an awful lot like .com bubble version 2.0. So I think all things massively overhyped. I may be wrong, but I do happen to think that because you've got increasing doubts about the validity of AI happening at the same time, Microsoft's technically weak. Nasdaq feels like it's rolling over. The whole tech story feels like it's starting to get a little bit stale now. Put it this way, I would be looking to fish in other waters.
Yeah. And they seem to be buying each other's. They seem to be investing millions and millions.
Circular investing, the whole thing looks very, very dodgy. It looks very, very Enron and WorldCom.
It is. Doesn't mean AI is not going to be helpful for us. And there might be like the Amazons, right? There might be 2, 3, 5 companies that make out the other end, and then they will help humanity. But I think at this stage, it is just very richly priced and nothing to do with fundamentals.
Yeah, we'd much rather buy on the basis of valuations we understand, and we're value investors. So by definition, it seems expensive. We're not going to touch it.
Yeah, fair enough. Hey, congratulations on your fund, obviously winning that 2025 award as well. I am working on seeing if there's something we can do behind the scenes for my clients, customers, for the Australasian market, if we could have something like that. But is there something that your fund might have learned from, or you see something differently in the last 12 months?
It's a good question. I think that the main thing is that we realized at the end of last year that 2026 was going to be a more challenging year, and we needed to consider how we could avoid getting bullied out of some of our positions by dint of the kind of price activity we saw last week. And so one thing we've added to our process that I'm quite happy with is, and this is a team effort, it's not dictated by any one of us, is we're a lot more respectful of technical analysis now. So we put a lot more technical analysis into the work for timing and also for position sizing. That's things like Elliott wave, momentum. It all helps. So it's one thing to identify value, but it's also quite helpful to get a sense of what the charts may be telling you. So for anyone that doesn't use technical analysis, bear it in mind. Keep an open mind.
Okay. And is there any index or sector or industry that you think might benefit in 2026?
Miners.
Okay. Right. Thanks for that. I would say defense stocks if you think there's war, if somebody asks me as well. Okay. I think I've covered everything, and the listeners have got a lot of knowledge. And if they've obviously not seen the first interview between you and I highly recommend they go and see that. Where can listeners find out more about you and what you do, Tim Price?
So we put out a lot of commentary for the clients and for interested parties. They can get a lot of that through the website, pricevaluepartners.com.
Okay. And you obviously have your own podcast as well, which I think is brilliant.
Which is the State of the Markets. Thank you for the plug. So yes, if anyone wants to look up the State of the Markets podcast, which I do with a friend, Paul Rodriguez, they're welcome to participate. As they say, misery loves company. And for anyone that's anyone that feels suitably concerned about the world, State of the Markets podcast is any gluttons for punishment out there.
Fair enough. Anything else you want to add that I might have missed?
If you're going to panic early.
There you go.
Or enjoy the party, but dance near the door.
Dance near the door. I love that one. Because the first one you mentioned, I think you'd mentioned in our first interview as well. So I love this one. I'll go with this one. Thank you.
There's nothing new under the sun.
There's nothing new under the sun. Hey, is the sun a few 100,000 miles away from us, or is it only a few thousand
It's just up
kilometers
the
away from
road.
us?
It's just up the road beyond a glass dome.
No, but I've seen, when you talk about physics and quantum theory and all of that, I've been looking at some of the explanations, and it kind of makes sense. Like in the 180 degrees, we talk about the moon landing and all of that kind of stuff, right? We were lied to about that. Our whole life, we think there's a moon and people landed on the moon. So I'll be surprised
I'm waiting for the truth about the aliens to be uncovered. I'm wondering how many of my colleagues may not actually be human.
Maybe they're not your colleagues. Maybe they're the guys placing bets on the other side in the derivatives market.
You see, this is what we have to bear in mind these days. You have to keep an open mind on everything.
Yeah, exactly. And I hope the audience doesn't think Tim and Farzin have lost his mind, but Tim and I have this weird sense of humor that even though the world is getting so serious and everything in the world is getting serious, we need to have a laugh once in a while.
Well, one of my favorites on this topic is by Lily Tomlin, American comedian, who said, things are going to get a lot worse before they get worse.
Yeah. All right, mate. Your humor as always. I hope everyone gets the jokes. I love it. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Tim, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.